Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our Fireside Chats. I'm Pallavi Ade, along with Shreyas Deshmukh. We're the co-founders of Asian Pathfinders. And today's very interesting session, and we're really glad to have Ambassador Tanveez Ahmed as the speaker and Dr. Soumya Chhabra as the moderator. Before I pass it on to Soumya, just a brief about us. We are a knowledge sharing platform. We started in 2020. The aim of our platform is to have these dialogues and discussions on a variety of topics where we bring scholars, academic practitioners like we have today for constructive dialogues and discussions on these topics. We have fireside chats on Saturdays and a dialogue that we have on the last Thursday of the month. And that's what I was just saying. And obviously, this entire month, we have a series on terrorism and violent extremism related issues. The series is part of that. Our next session on next Saturday is the evolution of countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism strategies, how they've evolved over the past decade since 2011. And we will be putting the session details on our social media, so do follow us there, and you can keep track of our events. Obviously, we also email who are on the mailing list, but if you're not, then please just go look up our social media pages. Community guidelines, respect the views of others. Please stay on mute. We do record and put the sessions on YouTube later, so that reduces the noise. And obviously respect intellectual property. We all come from different walks of life, so please do not put any defamatory, abusive contents in the chat section. That's where you put your questions and comments. So please don't do that. And please don't unmute yourself and start speaking in the middle of the speakers. That's disrespect. So please don't do that. And obviously, we will take the Q&A, have the Q&A section at the end of Ambassador Ahmed's opening remarks. So Soumya will take that. Like I said, we can stay in touch with Asian Pathfinders on our social media pages. Please do look up and do follow us there. So today's session, I will pass it on to Soumya in a second, but I'll introduce Soumya first. Soumya Chhabra is a political scientist with specialization in terrorism and political violence. She holds a PhD from the Department of Political Science, Trinity College Dublin, and her thesis studies the impact of autocracy or terrorism, a mixed method approach. Her research interests include international relations theory, civil military relations, national security, South Asian studies, and mixed method analysis. And Soumya does hope to apply her academic knowledge in a practical setting that will have an impact on societies, communities, and organizations. So over to you, Soumya.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Pallavi, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. So thank you for thinking of me for the role of moderator. A very good morning to everyone who's attending the event today. So today's topic of discussion points to a very important aspect of political violence as seen today, which is the role of ideology versus geopolitics. Extremism today has become synonymous with Islamic terrorism or jihadi terrorism, but this is only the most recent wave in the history of political violence. And before I begin, I would just like to clarify that I will be using the terms extremism, terrorism, political violence interchangeably, not because they mean the same thing, but just for the sake of discussion, the points I make applies to all forms of political violence. One of the main distinguishing aspects between conventional and non-conventional or asymmetric forms of violence has been the role of an ideological narrative, as opposed to traditional motives such as those of territorial control. In fact, almost every form of violent extremism has had an overarching narrative that has seemingly driven the violence. For example, in the post-Second World War, we saw the rise of extremism under the garb of nationalist movements against colonial rule. At the peak of Cold War, left-wing terrorism emerged aimed at the promotion of Marxist-Leninist agendas. Similarly, the more recent wave of Islamic terrorism has been rooted in the idea of jihad. When we look at ideological narratives, the literature on terrorism presents many theoretical frameworks. So for example, there is this idea of social disorganization or strain, which sees the rise of terrorism as a result of pressures of rapid development, wherein the traditional social norms gives way to rapid urbanization and inequalities. Theories of political order look into the characteristics of the states that incite acts of violence, such as regime type, effectiveness of state institutions, duration of regimes, level of civil and political freedoms, and even the economic levels. Yet another way to understand political violence is through the lens of a global order, which looks into the core periphery argument. Here, terrorism emerges in the peripheral states and targets the core in an attempt to balance the dependency. So religion-based extremism is only the latest form of extremism, which has followed these other narratives. On the other hand of the spectrum is the understanding that extremist violence is a rational activity based upon a careful cost-benefit analysis and on maximizing self-interest. So here, political violence is just a function of key strategic opportunities, and it is within this school of thought that we can assess the importance and relevance of geopolitical realities that shape violence. A classic example here is the creation of the Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was a result of an alliance between Sunni militants, the Pakistani state security establishment, and the American intelligence agency in the promotion of right-wing ideology in order to fight communism. Similarly, the recent extremist violence in the Middle East and the emergence of the Islamic State can also be traced back to the geopolitical fault lines that emerged as a result of the US invasion in Iraq. In both cases, the actual members of these terrorist or extremist groups were basically a ragtag group with minimal or no commitment to any religious ideology. For the top leaders of these groups as well, motivations often went beyond the ideological realm into ambitions of regional control. In fact, it has also been argued that in most cases of extremism, factors such as contagion and the availability of natural resources or weapons is key in actualizing violence. If you look at the civil war in Sierra Leone, what started as a movement against the ruling political class within a weak, flailing state transformed into the RUF, whose violence was indiscriminate and characterized by looting and material gains. So when we look at political violence, there's often been an opportunistic use of faith or ideology. While intuitively we are likely to link extremist violence to a cause or an ideological narrative, this doesn't really explain the situation on the ground. Now, this is not to say that this ideology versus geopolitics dichotomy cannot be bridged. In fact, it would be wrong to consider the strategy of violence as completely distinct from its ideological underpinnings. One way then to look at political violence is by distinguishing between root causes or systemic level factors and facilitating factors. So, for example, in the case of the Islamic State, sectarianism and structural weakness, state weakness in Iraq, combined with the realities of the power vacuum after the US invasion and the availability of weapons, this provides a more comprehensive understanding of the emergence of political violence. So as we can see, extremism is a very complex problem with many intertwined variables. And luckily for us, though, today we have a speaker who not only has the intellectual understanding of this phenomena, but also the rich experience as a practitioner in the volatile Middle East to help us reconstruct the intricacies of the role of ideology versus geopolitics. Ambassador Talmiz Ahmed served as the Indian ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE. He was the additional secretary for international cooperation in the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas from 2004 to 2006, and the Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs in New Delhi from 2006 to 2007. After retirement from foreign service in 2011, followed by a 4-year stint in the corporate sector, he is now a full-time academic and holds the Ram Sati Chair for International Studies at Symbiosis International University in Pune. He has published 3 books and regularly writes on issues related to political Islam, the politics of West Asia, Eurasia and the Indian Ocean, and energy security. Ambassador Ahmed, it is an absolute honor to have you here. So we'll begin with your discussion now, and then we'll take the questions from the participants. So I encourage the participants to drop in their questions in the chat box.
Thank you very much. As your introductory remarks have clearly shown, there is no acceptable dichotomy between the ideological aspects and the geopolitical aspects of matters relating to jihad. They are integrated. But let us first look at the ideological aspect. We've had a problem understanding jihad because we have never seriously contextualized it in larger disciplines of academia. The discourse relating to jihad was shaped fairly quickly after the end of the Cold War by extremist Zionists and like Bernard Lewis, his disciple Samuel Huntington. And they are the ones who then shaped, for example, 1990, Bernard Lewis writes the paper, The Rage of Islam. And then Samuel Huntington, his student and disciple, picks up Bernard Lewis's statement relating to Clash of Civilizations of 1956 and writes first an essay and then a book on that, now providing the Western Alliance with a new enemy described as Islam. This is an extraordinary conflation of a faith of 1 billion and odd people, and the people themselves are living across from Morocco up to Indonesia, with a third of them living as minorities in non-Muslim countries. This is a remarkable creation of this discourse relating to quote-unquote Islam. It is possibly the only use of the name of a faith to actually accommodate its entire set of believers as well as one. And this is what created the shape, a monolithic, a monochromatic view of an entire people as the other, as the enemy. And this then went into, there was no effort at actually studying the history, the culture, the language, and the dynamic of these diverse communities across the globe. It was a monolithic community, now described as the enemy of the Western world. It took curious shapes. For example, Huntington writes, Islam has bloody frontiers, bloody borders. And actually, when you analyze those borders, almost all of them have become bloody because of the interventions of Western powers. But he suggests that there is something inherently wrong with the faith and with the Muslim people, the idea that Bernard Lewis then continued to hammer out all through the 1990s and then became the most eminent scholar and the most eminent source of thinking in the White House after 9/11. And these two between them, particularly Bernard Lewis, picks up this old, thoroughly useless book called by Rafael Patal, The Arab Mind. It becomes the basic text to guide the Americans in the occupation of Iraq. It speaks of that the Arab only understands violence, that the Arab can be intimidated only through sexual humiliation. And all of this is then rapidly translated into activity. This kind of discourse, shaped from 1990 onward, then of course fed in very deeply into the politics of the neocons and the Israel lobby itself. And large parts of that are still with us all these years later. This is a remarkable change from the earlier period. Through the Cold War, the Western Alliance was taught to believe, and indeed believed, that Islam is your natural ally, because all these republics had become part of the Eastern Alliance and were very pro, quote-unquote, communist. Therefore, Islam, particularly as practiced by the monarchies, was an ally. And therefore, it caused no trauma whatsoever when when the confrontation against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan was then made into a global jihad. It would at one level be surprising that a global fate of so many people, so many millions of people, should then be mobilized as an instrument against the Soviet Union. But then that was all right because communism it was called godless communism automatically was then very easily put together. What the progenitors of this thinking failed to realize is the implications of this mobilization. You gave in Afghanistan, you had a cadre of indoctrinated people, well trained in weaponry, well trained in subversion, actually experiencing conflict. Some of them took the bullet in their chest, 1,500 or 2,000 of them, from all over the Muslim community. It was a state sponsored jihad with the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan coming together opportunistically to subserve domestic political interests. But that is what happened. But the implication of this jihad was completely missed by these fathers. And the main implication was that they won. The victory of jihad against the Soviet Union is the most significant Muslim victory as seen by the jihadis in about 300 years. What was the lesson learned by them? The lesson learned was that now Allah is with his believers because he had turned his back on them because they had deviated from the righteous path. And now he was back with them. And we had this bunch of people had a cadre, had a leadership, had funding, had support. Therefore, this became a global, when earlier it was a global jihad because all these people had come into Afghanistan, about 100,000 of them, 50,000 possibly Pakistanis, the rest about 25,000 Arab Afghans, and the others were from the rest of the Muslim world. Only two Muslim communities in the world failed to send a representative, and that is Oman and India. But they failed to realize the implication. Now it became a global jihad because these veterans were available to fight for their faith in different theaters. There was a debate. There was a serious internal debate represented on the one hand by Abdullah Azzam and on the other by Ayman Zawahiri, one advocate, and Ayman Zawahiri, of course, very influential with Osama bin Laden. We know this well now. Abdullah Azzam advocated the consolidation of jihad within Afghanistan, while Osama bin Laden had a global vision and advocated the confrontation with the far enemy. So this had a very clear geopolitical implication that we have fought in the past our enemies in the West Asian states, and we haven't really achieved anything. Sadat was killed, but he was replaced by Hosni Mubarak, and there was the same old arrangement. So we need to go beyond. The far enemy is the United States, and therefore this was a very significant change in the arrangement that what started in Afghanistan now became a major global confrontation. But then you had immediately thereafter not just the victory over the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Soviet Empire, which finally signified the success of jihad, you had the First Gulf War. And very few Westerners really understood the traumatic impact of this war on the region. Because as far as the region was concerned, this massive American assault upon Iraq and the destruction of the armed forces, particularly the Turkish shoot of several thousand of the soldiers as they retreated from Iraq, a kind of video game for the Americans, was a traumatic experience all across West Asia, because they saw once again a reaffirmation of their experience with colonialism and imperialism, which had destroyed their cultures and their states and their leadership and their self-confidence over the previous 200 years. This was seen as a continuum. And this fed into various ways to dissent. In Saudi Arabia, it led to the Sahwa and Islamic Enlightenment movement that became a major dissident force against the royal family. It also encouraged radicalization. Osama bin Laden, who had come back and was trying to work his way with the Sahwa, now found he was exiled, sent to Sudan, and therefore once again enmeshed himself with jihad as the instrument against state power. And then, of course, the rest of the narrative is well known. And that is what happened. That there is this business thinking that there is now resurrection of colonial authority within our region, and despite this pretense of independence, there is dissent in different places against state order, and there is also a radicalization of a certain community. When we look back now, we've had jihad with us for about 40 years or so. Academia has struggled to really understand and appreciate this because largely, I believe, due to the massive influence of political interest of national states and of certain lobbies behind them, particularly the Israel lobby and the neocons, has prevented an objective study in Western academia relating to this. And there are serious problems as well. It is truly requires multidisciplinary expertise. You need, for example, when you study a faith-based enterprise, you have to know in considerable detail various aspects of that faith, which requires you to have a knowledge of culture, knowledge of language, particularly the classical language, and the discourse relating to the faith, which has been shaped over several centuries. So that is one kind of expertise that you need. You also come into another area of Western style expertise, and that is area studies, that you need to have an intensive knowledge of a particular terrain and its early history and the various forces that have shaped it, its politics, its conflict, and the various influences that have played a role. And then, of course, you have various disciplines within the broad discourse relating to political science, political thought, for example. There is a criticism, for instance, that jihadi thought has not been given due space in the continuum of Western political thought, because jihadi thought is now condemned as something which is esoteric, quote unquote Islamic, and therefore they fail to realize that this jihadi discourse is actually much more complex and seriously influenced by Western thinking as well. So it is not something that is isolated in a seminary and is built up on the basis of classical Islam, but it is really borrowed very heavily right from Sayyid Qutb onward, very heavily from contemporary political thought. Recall here, for example, some of the thinking of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was, as the 20th century progressed, borrowed increasingly from the norms and of parliamentary democracy and took justification for those norms within the broad framework of political Islam. What we have found is jihad is largely confined to the broad area of security studies. So these complexities based on culture, of region, of politics, and thought, all of these are relegated and they are subordinated to the broad area of security studies. And the moment you come into security studies, you do not have any objective approach to this. It is largely restricted to your own security, hence the use of the term terrorism rather than violent extremism, which scholarship now insists upon very robustly. When we look at, for instance, political science, there are not just political thought. There are issues relating to resistance studies. As Soumya pointed out, that this is part of a broad range of resistance, resistance to hegemony, resistance to imperialism, clothed in a Western discourse, but very much an integral part of resistance, not very different from other resistance approaches that we have had in the West itself and in other countries. And this new aspect, which is now gaining a certain resonance in political science, and that is culture and identity. Culture and identity are today central to discussing and understanding all what this is about. When we now look at what has happened over the last 40 years and where we are likely to go. We see this interplay between the ideological aspect and the operational aspect. Yes, it is true that the ideological aspect is relatively thin even today. Yes, there are stalwarts who have emerged. We had the pioneers in Sayyid Qutb, Maududi, Abdul Salam Faraj, etc. Then you had the contribution of Abdullah Zam, of Ayman Zawahiri, of Turki bin Ali. All of these have contributed. But very often we believe or we think that it is the operational aspect that has influenced the thought and possibly not the other way around. Zarqawi comes into the Iraqi scenario and is virulently anti-Shia. And for operational reasons, for part of, you could call it political opportunism, Ayman Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden advised him not to be so virulent against the Shia because you will alienate support bases because people don't like mindless violence. And he gives a very robust answer. This man, who was a street corner hoodlum and was radicalized in jail, actually debates with Ayman Zawahiri on the subject of violence against the Shia. He finds this justification in Islamic discourse and quotes very happily Ibn Taymiyyah and even Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab to justify what he is doing against the Shia. So what you find, therefore, is that the operational aspect very often go much faster and ideological justifications move very rapidly behind, many of the justifications that Ayman Zawahiri gave for the events of 9/11 were given several months after the 9/11 events had occurred. And of course, they are extremely far-fetched and have very little to do with mainstream thinking. We also know that the rank and file of jihad have neither the knowledge nor interest in these broad ideological debates and themes that we are talking about today. Most of them, in fact, are known to have very little knowledge of their faith, and most of them have actually not really practiced their faith very seriously. And here we know that the motive force for overwhelmingly for jihadis has not been the doctrine drawn from their faith, however misguided it might have been. It is really speaking drawn from their own personal experience within a certain geopolitical framework, the suburbs of Paris, or some of the thinking relating to mistreatment, humiliation, oppression, revenge, and this whole business of revenge being the emotional motive force, and the sense that this person, the product of scholarly thinking, has now emerged, has possibly a historic role to play in the salvation of his faith and his people. Uh, the other point to note about jihad today is that the doctrinal aspects are neither rigid nor unilinear. You find massive debates within jihad. You find not serious disagreements among the principal ideologues. You find certain people in a set of political circumstances actually recanting and moving away. Makdisi, for example, has today was a severe critic of Zarqawi, his own student, at a time. And Makdisi today has moved on quite far from what he used to believe in earlier. This is also the case of Dr. Fadl. Dr. Fadl had started debating with Ayman Zawahiri and was sending documents on facts. And Ayman Zawahiri asked him that does the electricity wire that power your facts also once powered you and tormented you when you were in the hands of intelligence agencies, who then very politely guided you to a new terrain of thought. Also, we know that very often events relating to jihad and therefore the subsequent justifications that emerge are also very local specific, are based on a certain set of circumstances, bring in clan and tribe, like in the case of Somalia, governmental neglect, as in the case of northern Nigeria. So there are all these aspects as well. For example, today you find a fascinating development relating to the Taliban. Some year, 25 years ago, the word thought and the word Taliban might not have been ever used in the same sentence. But today you find a more sophisticated discourse is now available from Kabul and Kandahar. And one of their spokesmen actually described the Taliban as a national liberation movement against imperialism. It just happens to have a broad Islamic framework, but the fact that he could place the Taliban in the broad framework of activity against imperialism, which was the principal political, it was the principal political activism of the mid 19th century. He places his movement in that framework. So where do we now go from here? Yes, we need to do multidisciplinary studies, place jihad in a certain context, possibly move it away from the political agenda of the writers and of the governments who use those writings. But we have to know and accept that jihad is not just a transnational activity anymore. It is today embedded in the compulsions of domestic politics. For example, in India today, it very frequently you find state governments say declaring a certain person they have arrested that he's inspired by Al Qaeda. Or in Kashmir, they caught some people and said he is inspired by ISIS. No details need to be given. Thus, the mention of these two words. And moment you ask a little bit, what is this Al Qaeda influence on this person? Where did it come from? What are the texts that guided him in this? Because their entire effort is to ensure that this dissent is linked with something foreign and transnational and Islamic, rather than blame certain communal activity, homegrown activity that is taking place in the country itself. And similarly, you find the use of this discourse in support of populist politics in the West. The othering of the Muslim and conflating the Muslim and his faith with terrorism is the motive force for the rise of populism, best exemplified by, of course, Donald Trump in his time, but you have today Orban, Marine Le Pen, and many other populist leaders who have emerged. One last point, and with that I will stop. What is the future of political Islam? Political Islam emerged in a certain context beyond Afghanistan, which created the discourse, the base, and gave it the operational value. It became resonant as a source of dissent against oppressive rulers, authoritarian rulers. And for a certain moment, it had a certain resonance as well, particularly in the case of Egypt, where you had a brotherhood government, or you had in Tunisia a Nahda, and you have in Turkey the AKP, all of these affiliating themselves in one shape or form with political Islam. But then things are changing quite robustly. And Nahda has declared that it is no longer linked with political Islam in the case, and possibly, just possibly, we could be looking at a scenario where political Islam, as the bedrock of dissent, might be waning away to be possibly replaced by more active, a broader, more accommodative, more robust democratic movement, social democratic movements of different kinds. Not that the terrain is very fertile in this regard, but I suspect that we could be looking at the way, because when you see the Arab Spring agitations in the four recent agitations in the four countries of Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Lebanon. In Iraq and Lebanon, there is a rejection of the sectarian value in their political order. And none in the four countries, not one of them mentioned Islam or political Islam in any shape or form. Their demand from the street was for normal democratic order, a parliamentary order, one person, one vote, respect for human rights, respect for gender equality, etc. So you are looking possibly at a certain evolution, a maturing of the discourse that we have seen. But this is something we need to keep our eyes open to and see how it evolves over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful discussion. So before I open the Q&A section, I have one small question first, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the participants. So we've seen this ideology versus geopolitical or operational side, sort of the dichotomy, but there's another school of thought, so to speak, which talks about psychosocial factors or behavioral factors when it comes to violence or terrorism. So do you think this is some sort of a red herring, or do you think there is some basis to this claim that psychology also plays a role in inciting violence?
You are right. There has been writing on this subject. As you know, violence is such a broad subject, and even without the Islamic factor coming in, you have violence-related studies, which are the subject of analysis in numerous institutions. Where jihad is concerned, this attempt was made, and it had links with sexual frustration. One of the arguments made was that these people live in squalid conditions, in slums, etc., and do not have the wherewithal to have access to women and give them presents, take them out, etc. And this frustration generates in them violence. I think this thesis has been largely rejected. I don't think there is no scientific basis for this kind. Actually speaking, even today, with all the literature available on violent extremism and Islamic violence extremism, there is no explanation available today which would cover all of this. I think with each case, we still need to go to individual. My personal view is that absent the ideological factor in the rank and file motivation towards jihad, you find anger, revenge, and the desire for, there is this feeling of occupation, if you are under occupation, oppression, repression, and absence of justice. Now, as you know, the studies have shown that there is a movement from activism to dissent, organized dissent, into radicalism, and then violent extremism. There is a kind of progression. And the numbers involved become smaller and smaller and smaller. What is it that makes this one radical into a violent extremist? That link is not known. We don't know because we don't have enough knowledge. We need to do many more studies. And because this is so difficult to get into, the field work is very difficult. The many of the people who would be sources of information for you are actually dead. For example, suicide bombers. What makes a young person become a suicide bomber? You don't know because he's already blown himself up. So don't know. We are really speaking, we know very little. Also, our studies have been distorted very seriously by the political compulsions of governments and the intellectuals who support that discourse. But so I would never deny that there are psychological factors. But then how do you explain? Now, in the United States, you have the most advanced studies relating to violence, and yet it remains one of the most violent countries in the world. Yeah. That link is not there. So I think the same would apply here. We do not have in any country in the world a serious de-radicalization program that has worked or that has been subjected to scrutiny. We do not know anywhere where there has been counter-radicalization program which has been transparently discussed and available to us. So I think that we have such a long way to go and therefore the safety net for most governments is security. Beat them up, trash them, put them in jail, break their legs, break their heads, and you solve the problem. You haven't. You have seen that violence is the one instrument that has not worked with the jihadi. The more violence you use, he becomes a martyr. But that is the only language governments understand. And the Zionists and the Israel lobby have consistently told them that this is the way you must do. Look at what the Americans have done in West Asia. Iraq, raid on Iraq, 100,000 killed in a few days of bombardment, 1.5 million killed through the occupation. Look at their record in Iraq in the previous decade. Deliberate starving of the people and taking them to the old Stone Age. 500,000 children dead. And then you wonder in Washington, D.C., oops, why are these guys so violent? And why do they despise us? Oh, they despise us because we love freedom. They despise you because of your violence, the violence that you perpetrated on them. So I think that there is a deliberate misunderstanding of the discourse. The perceptions that we get from West Asia are fundamentally at variance as compared to what they choose to see in Washington and Tel Aviv.
Okay, there is a question from Sandeep Khanna. The shale oil and gas boom in the USA has made it a net exporter of oil and gas, reducing its economic interest in the Middle East to some extent. What implications, if any, do you foresee of this development on international politics and conflict?
You're absolutely right. The United States has valued West Asia originally because of the oil. And their discourse relating to the West Asia has not changed. Ever since they first wandered into the region in the 60s and 70s, their simple 3-point program, number one, free flow of oil. Number two, ensure this region doesn't come under the control of anybody else, either from within the region or outside. And number three, security of Israel. None of these is valid anymore. And you find that the Americans are confused. You see, the Americans' approach to West Asia never had a solid strategic perspective. You had this 3-point program that I mentioned to you, and it used to be touted as a mantra and clothed in the great word doctrine. So every American president has a doctrine. Therefore, you had all these doctrines but there is no thought and there is no diplomacy. You have every time you saw a problem, unleash the armed forces, bang up the country, kill a large number of people, and 20 years later, run as fast as you can because you left behind a completely devastated terrain. There has never been an application of the mind. So when we search for a vision or a strategy, we find ourselves completely false. So now it was energy. Now we are told the Americans are less interested. Israel doesn't need anybody's security. It's fully capable of looking after its own. Indeed, I would argue to you that Israel is the greatest source of insecurity in the region today. So Americans are today struggling for a policy. The joke in the United States is that every president comes to the White House and wants to get out of West Asia, not to have anything to do with West Asia. And yet something happens in West Asia to ensure that you're not able to get away. Trump said the same. Obama did this. Bush did this first. Obama did it. And also you had Trump. And now Biden has said the same thing. He wants to focus on China, whatever. But something will happen in West Asia to ensure that he's kept, the United States is kept. They don't know what they want to do. They see, sometimes you have the mantra, the regional states should be responsible for their own security. I love it. Yes, I agree. Why don't you get out and let the region handle its affairs? You say the region should be responsible, but you will never allow anyone else to have a role. Look at the Astana peace process in Syria. The Americans and the Europeans don't want any peace process if they can help it, if they are not part of it. But they don't want to be part of it. So you have this bizarre scenario, a near total absence of vision, near total absence of strategy. It is today a waning power. It's not waning in terms of power, it's waning in terms of influence because it doesn't know what it wants. And this confusion is what we are experiencing these days. That the Biden had, like all American presidencies in the early days, With regard to West Asia, the one word that describes them is confusion. And that is what we are seeing today. We don't know which way they will go. Will they, how will they, you have a new president, he abuses Mohammed bin Salman, doesn't want to talk to Netanyahu, is aggressive with Turkey by recognizing the Armenian genocide, says he wants to patch up with the Iranians, but doesn't know what he wants, what he put in the content. So you have confusion galore. And that is where we are today. And I think we will stay in this until a serious crisis comes up, either engineered from Washington or from Tel Aviv or from within the region. A crisis may come, and then the Americans will once again unleash their force. For example, what will happen if you don't have a nuclear agreement with Iran? Because what are the terms you are imposing on them? They have suffered the worst that the United States can impose upon another country. What more are you going to do to them? Today, they are not friendly. Are you going? Do you imagine that the Chinese and the Russians are going to sit quietly where you pummel this land? So I think you are looking at a very confused leadership, unable to understand and handle the geopolitics that has suddenly emerged in West Asia, which has made it quite different from what it was just a few months ago. Saudi Arabia and Iran talking to each other, Turkey talking to Egypt, Turkey talking to Saudi Arabia, talking the language of accommodation regarding Libya, regarding East Mediterranean. You find for the first time in 300 years, the leaders of this region are actually talking to each other about security issues without the Americans or any other imperial power earlier breathing down their neck. What a remarkable situation.
All right. There's a question from Shravan. Has the history of Western countries' struggle for their political system impacted their approach to political Islam and violent extremism? For example, France's history with secularism, UK's colonial history, or US's strong emphasis on its constitutional values?
Let us be very clear. There has been a fundamental dichotomy in the development of Western thought and institutions as far as they themselves are concerned and their approach to the colonies. Their approach to the colonies never at any stage reflected the values they had. They were a hardcore racist community and truly believed that these were inferior people with seriously inadequate civilizations who needed to be civilized by their healing presence. They never respected any of the people that they colonized unless they were white. Look at the trajectory relating to their ties with Australia, Canada, New Zealand, etc., and apartheid South Africa, and their treatment of the rest of the colonies, whether they were in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia. We were treated as seriously inferior people. Look at the discourse. I mean, it's there right across. Edward Said has simply put it all together, but it's there. It is there in their thinking and writing till the 50s. If you look at the now documentation available with regard to Winston Churchill, he was a hardcore racist. He despised India and Indians and had certain caricature views of the people. And he saw the perfidious Hindu, the valiant Muslim, but all were unthinking people, not brilliant. There was a Western scholar, very great scholar, who said the Semitic people are only half grown. He said this in the 50s. They are only half grown, that they started well, gave us civilization, and then withered away. And midway, the Western civilization is the most complete civilization. And if any one of you believes that this mental approach is gone, you are wrong. It's still a very powerful, motivating force. Otherwise, how do you explain the American assault and the massive killing of people in West Asia or Afghanistan? How do you justify it? How do you explain it? They do not, they believe this is a Turkey show. So there is Western, there are nothing of those values have ever impinged upon us. If there were certain institutions they developed, they were meant to support imperialist authority rather than grow the people. You remember the experience of the Mandate. They were supposed to civilize West Asia, but they were actually colonial experience. So I don't believe ever that there are any values from which we have. In fact, our leaders used to go to those countries and were shocked to see what was preached there and not implemented here. Whether you were Indian or Japanese or Chinese or Arab, this encounter has been an extremely painful encounter for most people who went across and saw these countries and how they lived there and how they treated the people in the colonized lands.
There is a question from Shreyas. As a bureaucrat, you were the practitioner and you have seen the operational aspects of policies from close quarter. But now as an academic, you have also studied the theoretical or ideological aspects. Was there any transition in your thought process in this journey in relation to today's topic? And also, how do you judge the understanding of the subject by Indian practitioners?
Firstly, my personal case, even I don't see any dichotomy between being a quote unquote practitioner and quote unquote an academic. Throughout my career, I used to support my work with very extensive reading. So my reports used to bring together both. For example, I opened the Indian mission in South Africa. We had nothing, not even a piece of paper. So I had to read a lot. The difference between a practitioner and an academic is that you get to meet a lot of people. So before I would write, say for example, the Arab Spring occurred when I was in Saudi Arabia. I had to read a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood and about other countries and what was happening there, Annada, etc., Rashid Ghanouchi. I had to read a lot. But I could also speak to other ambassadors. I could also speak to journalists, editors, etc. Wide range of people. I also met academics. This is a privilege that if you are an ambassador in a country or any other diplomat, you get to meet the best of that country. But you have to seek them out and you must know what to ask them. And you then build up a very solid knowledge base, a combination of extensive interactions on the one hand and extensive reading on the other. You cannot do one. If there is an impression that practitioner doesn't read, then it's wrong. You have to. And I think, therefore, for me, it was a seamless movement. Even I must mention to you that out of my 3 books, 2 were written when I was in service. My government encouraged me to read and write and to publish. I actually sent the text of my book, Children of Abraham at War, to government. And they said, and I said over there's nothing about India, and I have not criticized foreign affairs, nor have I used any classified document. They said, we don't need to read your text. Go ahead and publish. So there was that approach that so 2 of my 3 books, Reform in the Arab World and Children of Abraham at War, were published in service. I used to write articles in service as well, except if they pertain to my own area, like I was head of the Gulf Division, and I wanted to say something to the Indian reader, I wrote it under a pseudonym. But I wrote. There was a controversy at one time in India in 2003, where the Americans had asked India to provide soldiers for their war in Iraq. And they had actually identified that the Indian division will be located in Mosul. And the Indian army, preparing for this great enterprise, had actually put together a division and had also identified the Major General. I was completely appalled. And I thought this is a devastating development and it will harm India. So I wrote an article under a pseudonym. Only the editor knew that I had written. But I thought I should get my point of view across. So So I don't think there is no substitute for very, very extensive reading. And then, of course, another privilege we had, you could meet the writers of the articles that you read. You had that advantage as well. In Saudi Arabia, I met a number of academics who taught in university, and I also met journalists who wrote in the newspaper, and I could discuss with them what they had written. I must say to you, just very uh, quietly, that I knew Mr. Jamal Khashoggi, for example, when I was posted in Jeddah, when I was posted in Riyadh. I met him when he was the deputy editor, and you could talk to him about Afghanistan at that time because that was his expertise. He had been a reporter from Afghanistan. So you get to meet a lot of people, many more than if you were an academic, because very often people in service are terrified of speaking to academics, put certain rules and regulations, etc. I don't. If anybody asks to see me, even when I was in service, I know what to say and what not to say. I don't have to be indiscreet. If I say something stupid, I have to live with it. But it's not that person's fault. You must put the rules and regulations clearly on the ground and speak to that person. This is on the record. This is by way of deep background. And this is something which I won't say to you at all. You know how to
So, there's a question by Manoj. In the context of ideology versus geopolitics, how do you see the moves by Saudis and the UAE for closer relations with Israel? Is it likely to spread to other Muslim nations, or will it lead to a backlash? Yeah.
Well, Israel, see, we have focused a lot of attention on UAE opening ties with Israel, normalizing ties with Israel. We have never asked, what about Israel? Israel has also normalized ties with these Arab countries. Why don't we ask the Israeli perspective as to why they did that? You will get a very shallow answer that we are being accepted in the region without having to concede anything to the Palestinians. So the Palestinian issue remains. But then I point out to you, the Palestinian issue ceased to be an Arab issue in 1967. The Arab countries then decided that they will go on their own and pursue nationalism, regardless of the rhetoric. Palestinians have been looking after their interests on their own, and it's not always successful. And the Arab nations don't count particularly significantly in this regard. Now, with regard to the normalization, UAE did the normalization in a certain specific political context, and that political context was the re-election of Donald Trump and the troubles that Netanyahu was. It was August 2020. Trump had nothing to show for it. His numbers were not looking too good. Then UAE normalized, thinking that this might boost his electoral chances and also help Netanyahu. So there was a direct, immediate context. This has since moved on. We now know that UAE and Israel had a lot of contact earlier. Many Israelis, as you know, hold dual passports. So they could easily come into the UAE and travel all over with an American passport or some other passport. If you want to have a relationship, you can have with anybody. So this is not. Also, I am very uncomfortable when you use the term Muslim issues, whether there is a kind of divide between a monolithic community, the Muslim, and another monolithic community, the Jew. They are not. There is no religious divide over here. The concern is about Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people. And there is a certain view that the Palestinians have a case and they need to be accommodated. This is a view shared right across the world. So my own view is this normalization has no implications of a strategic character. It doesn't transform it. Saudi Arabia, as you know, was not, for various reasons, but really domestic concerns, able to really have a relationship, normalize a public relationship with Israelis. UAE could do that because in their own country, Emiratis are 12%. Indians are 60%. Emiratis are 12%. Much easier for the regime in UAE to make this initiative because it is a tightly controlled setup and is able to manage the relationship far more. In fact, Bahrain barely counts. And then you have Western Sahara, because of Western Sahara, Morocco came on board, and Sudan came on board because it wanted the description of a terrorist state to be removed. So these four countries had an opportunistic aspect. Not much is happening, not much is likely to happen because the strategic issues have not been addressed. And that is something that will be addressed only by Israel. When Israel is ready to, to understand, am I a Jewish state or am I a democratic state? If they answer this question satisfactorily to themselves, they will be able to understand that I really need to live with these 20% who are my citizens and another of these several million Palestinians whom I have dispossessed. I want to share one thought with you and your listeners, and that is this. There could be an unintended consequence of this normalization. And that is, for the first time, Israelis in large numbers, particularly young people, could travel to certain Arab countries freely and see an Arab who is well educated, professionally qualified, reasonably affluent, and living in cities that are better than most cities in Europe and United States. A successful Arab. They've never met such people. They have never met such people in their neighborhood. Therefore, if normalization means, number one, Israel accepts it's an integral part of West Asia, and flowing from this, accepts that its security is linked with West Asia, and recognizes that these are people who are not the enemy, the other, who deserve to be annihilated, you find a new generation of Israelis could emerge, maybe 10 years down the line, who will reject the compulsions of religious politics that is the bane of Israel. As you saw, the focus on Islam has meant that none of us has ever looked at the religious politics, the baneful religious politics of Israel. And some of those parties are mirror images of the Islamic State in ideological terms, extremely violent, extremely cruel people. So as that influence goes down, you could find a readiness to accommodate the Palestinian, which you have not seen so far. So you could have an unintended implication over a period of time, and hopefully that will reveal itself. We see the first step of that. First government in Israel in many years, without Netanyahu, without religious parties, part of a coalition that has an Arab. They are having very serious teething problems and may or may not survive, but things are changing. Things are changing in the region so rapidly that we are barely able to keep up and understand what is occurring.
Since it's already over 12, I'll just take one quick question and I'll end here because this is a relevant question. So I think it seems fair. This is a question from Rahul Kumar regarding what are the nuanced approaches that can be used to fight the internal conflict right now, leading to a civil war in Afghanistan.
Sorry, start again if you don't mind.
Sorry,
I was a bit distracted.
So this is a question. What are the nuanced approaches that can be used to fight the internal conflict which is leading to a civil war in Afghanistan?
This is not the first civil conflict in Afghanistan. We have had the global jihad led to a very, very major civil conflict from the 90 to 94 was the first fight between the warlords. More people were killed in that conflict than they were throughout the Soviet occupation. From 94 onwards, you had the civil conflict between Taliban and the rest. And by 96, the Taliban had captured about 90% of the country, and only the northern area was left. Since then, we have had sustained conflict when the Americans got in. All the literature relating to Afghanistan tells you that the Americans had no clue at any time in their 20-year period as to why they were there. Read the books which have come out since. There are good books that have come out which have got information from the people who were defining policy at that time. There were serious debates within them. The armed forces, the CIA, the State Department, the level of confusion was extraordinary. Are we there to pacify? Are we there or are we there for national development? Are the two linked? Are we there to ensure just this minimum that there will be no force emerging in Afghanistan that will do another 9/11 upon us? When do we declare success? When we have a successful democratic order in Kabul that controls the entire country? Or we have so debilitated the Taliban and the Al Qaeda? Or is there a difference between Taliban and Al Qaeda? Taliban have no hostility to the Americans. It is the Al Qaeda. We've decimated Al Qaeda. So Al Qaeda is no longer in a position to launch an assault upon us. So this kind of confusion is there throughout the 20 years. And therefore, not surprisingly, they can, when Biden comes in, he sees no strategic value in continuing to say that he can't wait to go. What you are seeing today is a replay of that. The Soviet Union withdrew in defeat and left behind a sustained 6-year civil conflict. The Americans are leaving in defeat, and you are likely to witness a prolonged civil conflict. May not be 6 years, maybe shorter. What you will see is that the Taliban has firstly, you have to accept that any order that emerges in Afghanistan will be dominated by the Taliban. But what has changed? The Taliban is not the monolithic entity that it was in the 1990s. It is split into several factions. It has got quote unquote moderate elements. Some of them in the last 25 years have had exposure. After all, these are the people who sat and negotiated with the Americans over prolonged periods at various times and held their own. And it is the Americans who are packing and leaving, not the Taliban. So you will have that order. Which aspect of the Taliban is likely to be dominant? What kind of shape? Firstly, let us be clear, it is not going to be a democratic order. It is not going to be a constitution on the lines of the constitution the Americans might have wished for, gender equality, etc. It is going to be a very conservative and traditional constitution. The status of women will not be as equal. You will have very few women wearing skirts. You're going to see over the initial period a very difficult time. But this is something that they have to resolve themselves. We have never given them a chance because we've always had someone else telling them what to do. First, you had the Russians. And when the Russians left in ignominy, you have the Pakistanis. And then you Pakistanis play games over there. And you had the Americans and the Saudis and the Qataris and the UAE, always someone else determining your existence. So today, possibly in 2021, for the first time in 50 years, you could have Afghanistan, actually Afghans, discussing with each other how to shape their future. Will there be problem areas? Of course. Number one problem area is the Haqqani network. Haqqani network remains a radical movement and an extremely violent movement, not likely to compromise. Can it be managed and controlled? We do not know. Second is the role of Pakistan. On the one hand, we know that Pakistan wants to dominate the Kabul, Afghanistan, in the name of strategic, strategic depth. But does Pakistan want to have a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan? It has implications for their own extremist movements, which they have pandered to for so long. But now these movements will not be under their control. They have extremist movement, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, etc. They are managed by them, controlled by them, guided by them, funded by them, armed by them. These are not going to be under their control. They don't need their arms, they don't need their training, they don't need their indoctrination. Second is the element of Pakhtun or Pathan affinity, cross-border affinity. No Afghan has ever accepted the Durand line. Not even Mullah Omar, completely a creature of Pakistan, never accepted the Durand line. So Pakistan could be in a scenario of having to moderate some of its approaches. And I'm not clear whether it has really thought this through. I'm not clear. The two role players you have to watch are China and Russia. They have not shown their hand. They have worked behind the scenes. They have had very substantial ties with the Taliban for, in the case of more than 10 years. They have, while the Americans were making a mess of themselves for all these years, it is China and Russia that I would watch. And we also know that they are both of them separately and jointly very close to Pakistan. They are also very close to Iran. So what I would look at is that if there is a management of the situation in Afghanistan, it will be managed by these two. What about India? India actually some years ago closed its foreign office and is no longer a serious functioning entity. It is no longer seriously interested in foreign policy. It is not a role player in regional and world affairs. It is busy reinventing the domestic situation at home on the basis of a new set of values. Therefore, nobody either bothers what India has to say, nor is there any space for India to play any constructive role. This constructive role cannot be done overnight. Oops, the Americans are going, I should do something. This is a continuous process. Any one of us who has even minimum interest in the region would have said, you should have been engaged with Afghanistan from 2001. And you should have been very deeply engaged. Now every academic is writing, talk to Taliban. Talk to Taliban what? What are you going to say to them? You don't even know their names properly. You don't have a policy. You don't have a vision. You don't have, just like the Americans. Because your efforts today are completely consumed by how to reshape the idea of India. And that is the priority enterprise. And the entire energy of the nation's top leaders and their rank and file is devoted to this. And I find that all of this sporadic activity has no purpose. So I'm not sure that we have anything to do or say. We will have to live with the consequences. We have abdicated responsibility in the region of priority strategic value to us. But that is the way we are. And any one of you who believes that I have made a remark that is not accurate and does not accurately describe the situation, please do contradict me. And please give me the reassurance that we are bound to subserve our interests. And I would be reassured. I don't get that reassurance. I have studied the situation very, very carefully. I have been writing about an Indian role in West Asia for 8 years. I have said this is a region of extraordinary importance to us. And we cannot afford conflict in this region. We have to be involved. We have to reshape our approach from the transactional and bilateral approach into something which is much more active, much more involved. And that is our interest. I used to say finally to someone who didn't understand geopolitics or energy, I used to say, what about your people? You have 8 million people living there. If you have a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, on day one of the war, several thousand Indians will be killed. When your leader's heart bleeds for one maid servant mistreated in a remote corner of Saudi Arabia, how can you be indifferent to the fate of these people? And yet, from that day till today, I see no change. We remain transactional and bilateral in our approach. And that I had said, and one of the points I had argued, we need to work with West Asia. Because today Afghanistan is an integral part of West Asia, as is Pakistan. All these West Asian countries are deeply involved with Afghanistan. So this was going, I had a very broad geopolitical framework animating my thinking, that from Pakistan up to the Mediterranean and beyond up to Morocco, this is an integrated security landscape. And you have to be actively involved. I welcomed Mr. Modi in 2014 when he started reaching out to these. I got disenchanted about 3 years ago when I noticed that they have absolutely no vision of foreign affairs. and just have these sporadic events which are not part of any strategy. So this is my unfortunately pessimistic answer to you. I wish I had something better to say, but this is where I am.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your time and for such detailed answers that drew from your own experience in the region. It's been an honor to host you.
Thank you very much. I apologize for overshooting. All of you must be very seriously distressed by this lack of respect for your time schedule. And thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me. I love to speak to young people. That is the only value that I have, is to pass on what little I have learned to the next generation and the one beyond. And also to learn from you, because your perspectives are very different from mine. Whatever I gained was in the framework of government service. Therefore, this government of India and the people of India funded me. These are ways in which very small effort that I make to pass on what I have learned over all this period and to share it with you. Okay. There's somebody who wants to have my email ID. Please freely give everybody. I don't have social media, so you can't abuse me. I don't have Twitter. I don't even know what is Facebook and whatever. I do have a Gmail, and I'm quite happy for anyone to use it. And if so please do share it.
Thank you. We'll definitely do that. I know a few of others also reached out to me privately to connect with you. So I think a lot of the questions did go unanswered, and apologies because, time constraints. So definitely, please reach out to Ambassador Ahmed and Soumya. Soumya, we also have requests to connect with you for a lot more questions about your dissertation. So I'll definitely connect whoever is requested with the speaker and the moderator. And thank you to Ambassador Ahmed and Soumya for joining us and having this very candid discussion on a very, very difficult topic, I think sometimes, but thank you so much. And we look forward to hosting you in our future sessions. So have a good weekend, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and all the best to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Soumya.
Thank you.